The crystal of the glasses reflected the golden lights of the ballroom as the woman's sharp laughter echoed among the guests. The man with calloused hands lowered his gaze, the suit weighing on his shoulders like armor that didn't belong to him. Across the room his son watched in silence, his face tense, his fists clenched. What no one knew was that on that night, in that moment of humiliation before everyone, the destinies of two lives were about to change forever. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The orchestra's music seemed distant as Joseph entered the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. His fingers, marked by 40 years of work at the auto repair shop, trembled slightly as he adjusted the borrowed tie. The black suit, bought in a hurry from a downtown store, itched in places he never imagined could itch. But it was his son's invitation, and he wouldn't miss it for the world. "Dad, I'm so glad you came." Richard's voice sounded different there, more formal, as if the luxurious environment had changed even the way his own flesh and blood spoke. His son, now one of New York's most promising entrepreneurs, wore a tuxedo that surely cost more than 3 months of the salary Joseph earned at the shop. "I want to introduce you to some important people." Joseph nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew he didn't belong in that place. The expensive perfume that filled his nostrils, the delicate clinking of silver cutlery, the conversations in languages he didn't understand, everything seemed to conspire to remind him that this was foreign territory. But the pride he felt for his son was greater than any discomfort. The party was to celebrate the launch of Richard's new technology company. Investors from Chicago, entrepreneurs from abroad, Manhattan socialites, all circulated through the ballroom with the natural elegance of those born into that world. Joseph tried to smile and nod politely when someone greeted him, but he noticed the sidelong glances, the furrowed brows of those trying to decipher who this simple man was in the midst of so much sophistication. "Richie, darling." The shrill voice cut through the air like a razor. Joseph turned and saw a tall, blonde woman in a red dress that shimmered more than the chandelier lights. She approached Richard with feline movements, her high heels clicking on the marble like tiny thunderclaps. "What a marvelous party. Everyone is here. Thank you, Vivian. This is Vivian Montgomery, one of our investors." Richard made the introduction with a forced smile. Joseph noticed the tension in his son's voice, something only a father can perceive. "Vivian, this is my father, Joseph." Joseph extended his calloused hand, but Vivian just waved her fingers as if greeting a child. Her blue eyes scanned the man from head to toe, lingering on the ill-fitting suit, the nails that still held traces of grease, the old shoes he had shined 3 times before leaving home. "How interesting," she said, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "It's always good to know the origins of a successful entrepreneur." The way she pronounced the word origins made Joseph's stomach churn. Richard swallowed hard. "My father is a mechanic," Richard said, his voice lower. "He worked his whole life to give me an education." What a touching story. Vivian clapped her hands delicately as if watching a play. "It's truly inspiring to see how some people manage to rise in life, isn't it?" Other guests began to approach, drawn by the conversation. Joseph recognized some faces from television, people he saw in commercials and on the news. He felt like an animal in a zoo, observed and judged by specimens of a different species. "Your father seems like a very hard-working man," commented a grey-bearded gentleman, a partner in a large construction firm. The tone was condescending, like someone praising a dog for sitting on command. "He is," Joseph answered for the first time, his voice hoarse. "I've worked at the same shop for 40 years. I started at 16 when my father died." An awkward silence fell over the small circle that had formed around them. Joseph realized he had said something wrong, but he didn't know exactly what. Vivian exchanged a knowing look with the woman beside her, a malicious smile playing on her lips. "What a moving story," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. It must be interesting for you, Richard, to move between two worlds so different. Richard took a deep breath. Joseph saw a vein pop on his son's forehead, a sign he had known since childhood. Whenever Richard got nervous or angry, that vein appeared. But there, surrounded by those important people, his son seemed frozen, as if the words had lost their way to his mouth. "Dad, can you come with me for a minute?" Richard touched his father's arm, trying to pull him away from the group. "I want to show you the view from the balcony." But Vivian wasn't finished. "Wait, Richard. Don't be shy. We're all curious to know more about the family." She turned to Joseph, her eyes glinting with malice. "Mr. Joseph, you must be proud to see your son achieve all this, aren't you? I imagine it's very different from what you were used to." Joseph felt the blood rush to his face. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. Each word carried a weight, an intention he recognized all too well. It was the same tone some customers used at the shop when they found out he couldn't read a complex manual, or when they tried to haggle over his labor. "I'm very proud of Richard," he replied, his voice firm for the first time that night. He was always a special boy, studious, dedicated. Since he was little, I knew he would go far. How lovely, Vivian sighed theatrically. It's truly emotional to see how a father's love can overcome social limitations. The word limitations hung in the air like a slap. Joseph felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Beside him, Richard turned pale, his fists clenched. For a moment, father and son looked at each other, and in that gaze were 40 years of history, of sacrifice, of unconditional love. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice tense. "I need to take care of something. I'll be right back." And then he walked away, leaving Joseph alone in the middle of that circle of perfumed sharks. The simple man looked around, seeing the fake smiles, the looks of pity mixed with contempt. For a moment, he considered leaving, hailing a cab, and going back to his small apartment in Queens, where he felt at home. But something inside him refused to run. Maybe it was his wounded pride, or maybe it was the voice of his late wife, echoing in his mind, telling him he should never be ashamed of who he was. Mary always said that a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he does with what he has. "Your son is taking a while to come back," Vivian observed, savoring every word. "Perhaps he went to get the driver to take you home." The laughter that followed was like a series of stabs. Joseph closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, there was something different in his gaze. A decision had been made, a line had been crossed, and at the exact moment he opened his mouth to respond, Richard reappeared in the ballroom, walking toward the group with something in his hand that gleamed under the chandelier lights. What no one imagined was that this object would change the course of the night forever. The old gold pocket watch shone in Richard's hand like a sacred amulet. It was an Omega from 1952, an heirloom from the grandfather Joseph had never known, but which he treasured as his most precious possession. The silence that fell over the group was different from before. This time, it was charged with expectation and curiosity. "This watch," Richard began, his clear voice echoing through the ballroom, "has marked every second of the life of the most honorable man I know." Vivian arched an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the young entrepreneur's change in tone. The circle of guests expanded as other people drew closer to hear what sounded like the beginning of an important speech. Joseph's eyes widened as he recognized the object. It was the watch he kept in his nightstand drawer, the one he only took out on special occasions. "My son," Joseph whispered, but Richard raised a hand asking for silence. "When I was 8 years old," Richard continued, walking slowly among the guests, the watch still in his palm, "I would wake up every day at 5 in the morning to the sound of this watch. It wasn't an ordinary alarm. It was my father getting up for work." The orchestra had stopped playing. Waiters stood frozen mid-floor, trays balanced in their hands. It was as if the entire party had paused to listen to this story. He'd have black coffee, no sugar, because sugar was expensive. He'd put his lunch in his bag, always rice, beans, and an egg when we had it. And he'd leave in the dark to get to the shop by 6 o'clock sharp. Richard's voice gained intensity with each word. Never in 20 years was he late. Vivian shifted her weight, the sarcastic smile beginning to fade. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, as if they sensed something was about to change drastically. "Do you know what it's like to work with your hands for 40 years?" Richard asked, looking directly at Vivian. "Do you know what it's like to come home with your fingers cut, your back aching, the smell of oil ingrained in your skin, and still smile for your son who's doing his homework?" Joseph felt his eyes well up. He remembered every one of those nights when he would arrive exhausted and still help Richard with math, English, science, nights when his own fingers could barely hold a pencil to show him how to do a calculation. "When I was 12, I wanted a video game for Christmas. All my friends had one. I asked for it. My father smiled and said he'd see what he could do." Richard paused, taking a deep breath. "On December 23rd, he sold this watch." A murmur went through the group. Joseph closed his eyes, remembering the pain he felt that day. The watch was the only inheritance he had from his father, the only thing of value he owned. But the joy in his son's eyes on Christmas morning was worth any sacrifice. I only found out years later, when I asked why he didn't wear the watch anymore. He said it was broken, that it wasn't worth fixing. Richard swallowed hard. He lied, so I wouldn't feel guilty. Vivian tried to interrupt, but her voice came out as a whisper. "Richard, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." He cut her off, his tone now hard as steel. "I have to because you laughed at the man who worked double shifts for 6 months to buy this watch back, who saved every penny, who ate bread and margarine for lunch to scrape the money together." The ballroom was in absolute silence. Even the waiters had stopped, trays forgotten, listening to every word of this public confession. "Do you know when he managed to buy it back?" "On my graduation day. He came home at 11 at night after working 14 hours, took this beauty out of his pocket and said, 'Now I can give you the gift you deserve.'" Richard's voice trembled. It was the watch. The same watch he had sold to bring me joy 6 years earlier. Joseph covered his face with his hands. The memories of that day came back like an avalanche. The joy he felt holding his father's watch again. The satisfaction of being able to give his son something that represented the continuity of the family. The history, the love, passed from generation to generation. And do you know what he told me when he gave it to me? Richard turned directly to Vivian, who was now pale. He said, "This watch will measure the time of your life. May it be a life worth timing." A man in the back of the group cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. An elderly woman, whom Joseph recognized as the mother of one of Richard's partners, put a hand to her chest, moved. "During college, when I didn't have money for the bus, he would wake up at 4 in the morning to take me on his bicycle to the university. 9 miles there, 9 miles back, before starting his own workday." Richard now paced like a lawyer before a jury. "When I needed money for my MBA at Harvard, he worked overtime for a whole year. Sundays, holidays, late nights." Vivian tried to step away discreetly, but she was surrounded by the other guests. There was no escape. "And do you know what he said to me when I came back from Boston with my MBA? 'Now you can fly, son, but never forget where your wings came from.'" Richard stopped right in front of Vivian. "This man you humiliated today is not just my father. He is my hero." Joseph could no longer hold back his tears. 40 years of sacrifice, of hard work, of unconditional love were being acknowledged there, in front of all those people who had despised him just minutes before. But do you know what the most impressive part of this story is? Richard smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone about to deliver the final blow. "When I started making money, I offered him a better house." Do you know what he said? No one dared to answer. He said he didn't need a bigger house, that the important thing wasn't the size of the house, but the size of the heart of the person living in it. Richard looked around, his eyes stopping on each face. "And today, watching you laugh at him, I perfectly understood what he meant." Vivian tried one more time. "Richard, I wasn't laughing at him, I was just..." You were what? Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. Making a joke? Being sociable? Breaking the ice? The silence that followed was deafening. Joseph looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride for the courageous man Richard had become, concern for the price that courage might cost. "Let it go, son," Joseph said quietly, touching Richard's arm. "You don't need to do this. These people aren't worth your energy." But Richard wasn't finished. He looked at his father, then at Vivian, and made a decision that would change not just that night, but the rest of their lives. "You know what, Vivian?" he said, his voice now calm, controlled. "You're right. My father and I really do live in different worlds." Joseph frowned, not understanding where his son was going. "The difference is that in his world, people have dignity. In yours, apparently, they don't." And then, in front of all the guests, Richard did something no one expected. Richard took off his tuxedo jacket and held it out to his father. "Wear this," he said, his voice as firm as granite. Joseph looked at his son, uncomprehending. "Richard, what are you doing?" "Trade clothes with me, Dad. Now." A murmur of disbelief swept through the ballroom. Vivian's eyes widened, and other guests began to whisper among themselves. What was happening seemed too surreal to be true. "Son, have you gone crazy?" Joseph tried to back away, but Richard held his arm gently. "I've never been more lucid in my life." Richard began to loosen his bow tie. "For years, I was ashamed of your calloused hands when you came to pick me up from school. I was ashamed of your simple ways when my wealthy friends came over. I was ashamed to say my father was a mechanic." Joseph felt his heart break. "Richard, let me finish, Dad." Richard took off his tie and began to unbutton his dress shirt. "I spent my whole life trying to run away from who I was, from where I came from. I built this empire thinking that this way I would be accepted, respected, that this way I could belong to this world." Vivian tried to move away, but was literally cornered by the other guests who had formed a circle, all mesmerized by the scene unfolding before them. "But today, watching you humiliate the man who gave me everything, I understood something." Richard took off his shirt completely, leaving just his white undershirt. "I don't want to belong to a world where people like you exist." Joseph was paralyzed, watching his son strip away not just the clothes, but the entire persona he had built over the years. Richard held out the dress shirt to his father. "Wear it, Dad. It's yours." "I can't accept this, son. You worked so hard to get here. I worked to get to the wrong place." Richard smiled, and this time it was a genuine, liberated smile. "The right place is by your side." With trembling hands, Joseph accepted the shirt. It was Italian silk, costing more than his 3-month salary. But that wasn't what moved him. It was the gesture, the meaning behind that moment. "And you, Vivian," Richard turned to the woman who was now visibly flustered. "Do you want to know the difference between me and my father?" She didn't answer, just stared at him with wide eyes. He never needed to humiliate anyone to feel important. The words fell upon the ballroom like bombs. Some guests lowered their heads, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Others watched, fascinated, as if they were watching a live Shakespearean drama. "Richard, you're making a mistake," intervened Dr. Morris, one of the main investors. "These people are important for your business." "You can't." "Can't what?" Richard interrupted him. "Defend my father. Have dignity. Choose what's right over what's convenient." Dr. Morris swallowed hard. He was a man accustomed to being in command, to being obeyed. But here he was, confronted by a young entrepreneur who had clearly lost his fear of the consequences. "You're going to destroy everything you've built," Vivian said, her voice now trembling. "Over a tasteless joke?" "A joke?" Richard laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "You humiliated my father. You laughed at him. You made him feel small on the day that should have been one of the proudest of my life." Joseph had put on the shirt, which was slightly large on him, but it transformed him instantly. It wasn't just the clothes, it was his posture, his recovered dignity, the sparkle that was slowly returning to his eyes. "And do you know what hurts me the most?" Richard continued, now walking through the circle of guests like a teacher before a class of shamed students. It's that you don't even realize what you've done. To you, it was just a joke. To him, it was a lifetime of work being disrespected. An elderly woman, who had been silent until then, took a step forward. It was Mrs. Eleanor, the widow of a great industrialist, respected throughout New York society. "The young man is right," she said, her voice firm despite her advanced age. "I saw what happened here, and I am ashamed to have remained silent." Vivian turned to her, surprised. "Mrs. Eleanor, you can't be serious." "I am more serious than I have ever been." The woman approached Joseph and gave a slight bow. "Mr. Joseph, I apologize on behalf of all of us." "You deserve respect, not scorn." Joseph blushed, not knowing how to react. He wasn't used to being treated with such deference, especially by someone of Mrs. Eleanor's social standing. "You don't need to apologize, ma'am," he murmured. "I understand that—" "No," she interrupted him. "You don't understand. You raised a man of integrity in a world that rewards a lack of character. That is an achievement that all the money in the world cannot buy." Richard looked at Mrs. Eleanor with gratitude. She was the first person besides himself who had taken the right side in this story. "Now I am going to make an announcement," Richard said, turning to all the guests. "This party is over. Not for you. Stay, drink, eat as you please. But for me and my father, it's over." "You can't do this," protested Dr. Morris. "We have contracts to sign, deals to close." "The contracts can wait. The deals can wait. My father cannot." Richard turned to Joseph. "Dad, do you want to leave this place?" Joseph looked around, seeing all those faces of surprise, indignation, embarrassment. Some guests seemed genuinely sorry, others just annoyed that their evening of fun had been interrupted. "I do, son. But I have one thing to say first." Richard frowned. "What is it, Dad?" Joseph took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and for the first time that night, his voice sounded strong and clear. "I am not ashamed of being a mechanic. I am not ashamed of my dirty hands, my simple ways, my small house in Queens." He looked directly at Vivian. "Because I know that these hands built the man who is here today, defending what is right." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the orchestra had stopped completely. "And you," Joseph continued, now addressing the whole group, "you have money, you have power, you have influence. But you don't have what I have." "And what is it that you have?" asked Vivian, her voice almost inaudible. Joseph smiled, put his hand on his son's shoulder, and said the most powerful thing that would be said that night. "I have a son who would rather lose everything than see me be humiliated." The tears that began to roll down the faces of some guests were proof that those words had hit their mark. Because there, in that gilded ballroom full of important people, a simple mechanic had just taught a lesson about what truly matters in life, and the night was far from over. Father and son were walking toward the exit when a voice stopped them. "Wait!" It was Dr. Morris. The man approached with slow steps, his face etched with an expression Richard couldn't decipher. For a moment, he thought the investor was coming to demand an explanation, perhaps to threaten to withdraw financial support from the company. "Richard," Dr. Morris said, stopping a few feet from them, "in 40 years of business, I have never seen anything like what just happened here." Richard braced himself for the worst. Joseph held his son's arm, as if to protect him from what was to come. "And you know what?" Dr. Morris continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm deeply ashamed that I didn't have the courage to do the same when my own father was humiliated in a similar situation 20 years ago." The confession fell upon them like a lightning bolt. Richard's eyes widened, and Joseph lowered his head, moved. "My father was a doorman in a commercial building. When I started getting rich, I spent years pretending he didn't exist. When he died, the last thing he said to me was that he understood why I was ashamed of him." Dr. Morris wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I would give everything I have to have had your courage, Richard." Joseph approached the older man. Sir, your father surely loved you very much, and I'm certain that wherever he is, he understands that you were young and made a mistake. You are very generous, Dr. Morris sighed. More generous than I deserve. Other guests began to approach. First was Mrs. Eleanor, then a couple of entrepreneurs, then a young lawyer. One by one, as if a dam had broken, people began to confess their own stories of shame, regret, moments when they failed to defend those they loved. I never brought my mother to company events, confessed a politician's wife. She has a thick rural accent, only studied up to the 4th grade. I always made excuses for her not to come. My brother has Down syndrome, said another businessman, his voice choked with emotion. For years, when people asked if I had siblings, I said I was an only child. Joseph listened to each confession with a heavy heart. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who suffered in silence, who were hidden, denied, rejected by those who should love them unconditionally. "Stop," said a harsh voice. Everyone turned. It was Vivian, who had remained distant during this wave of confessions. Her face was red, her fists clenched. "Stop all this drama," she exploded. "You're all acting as if you've committed some crime. It was just a joke." The silence that followed was glacial. Mrs. Eleanor took a step forward, her eyes flashing with indignation. "My dear," she said, her voice as sharp as steel, "the only person here who hasn't understood a thing is you." Vivian tried to retort, but Dr. Morris interrupted her. "Vivian, I suggest you leave now. You can't kick me out of here." "Yes, I can. This party was paid for with my money, and I don't want people like you in my investment." The revelation caused another murmur. Dr. Morris was the main financier of Richard's company. He had the power to make that threat. Vivian looked around, seeking support, but found only looks of disapproval. Even her own friends had distanced themselves, embarrassed by the situation. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but her voice no longer had the same force. "You're all going to regret this." "The only thing I regret," said Richard, "is allowing a person like you to be part of my life." Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't form the words. She turned abruptly and stormed out of the ballroom, her high heels echoing on the marble like gunshots. When she disappeared, the atmosphere changed completely. It was as if a heavy cloud had dissipated, allowing the light to enter again. "Well," said Mrs. Eleanor, adjusting her purse, "now that the storm has passed, how about we get to know Mr. Joseph better?" Joseph looked at her, not understanding. "Know what, ma'am?" "Your story, your experiences. 40 years in mechanics must make for fascinating stories. I don't know if—" "Dad," Richard interrupted him, smiling, "tell them about the day you fixed the mayor's car on the side of the road." Joseph blushed, but there was something different in his embarrassment now. It was no longer shame. It was genuine shyness mixed with a growing pride. "Oh, that was just luck," he began, but Mrs. Eleanor cut him off. "No modesty. We want all the details." And then something magical happened. Joseph began to tell the story, and the guests gathered around to listen. His voice, once hesitant, gained confidence. His gestures, once restrained, became expressive. For an hour, that simple man from Queens became the center of attention in the most elegant ballroom in New York City. He told them about the day he fixed a school bus full of children that had broken down in the rain, about the time he worked all night to finish the car of a pregnant woman who needed to get to the hospital, about the customer who had no money and whom he helped anyway. "You're a hero," said the young lawyer. "How many lives have you touched with your work?" Joseph shook his head. "I just do my job. Nothing special, nothing special." Dr. Morris laughed. "Mr. Joseph, you've saved lives, helped families, built a community. That's more noble than any deal I've ever closed." Richard watched the scene, with his heart overflowing. Seeing his father being recognized, admired, respected, was better than any professional success he could ever achieve. "You know what, Dad?" he said when the stories ended. "I have a proposal for you." Joseph frowned. "What proposal, son?" How about you help me rebuild my company? Not as an employee, as a partner. The ballroom fell silent again. Joseph's eyes widened. Richard, have you lost your mind? I don't understand anything about technology, about business, but you understand people. Honesty, hard work, values. Richard approached his father. I built a company with a lot of money and little heart. I need someone to teach me how to do the opposite. Joseph looked around, seeing all those faces waiting for his answer. For a moment he felt dizzy. It was too much responsibility, too much change, too much of a dream. But then he remembered the words he always told his son when he was little. In life, my boy, you either grow or you stop. There's no in-between. All right, he said, his voice firm, but on one condition. What's that? Joseph smiled, took the watch from his pocket and handed it to Richard. That you start wearing this again. To remember that the most important time isn't what tracks business, it's what tracks the heart. Richard took the watch, feeling the familiar weight of the metal in his hand. But this time it wasn't just an object, it was a symbol. Of family, of values, of right choices. And when he put it in his pocket, he knew his life would never be the same. 3 months after that night at the plaza, the lives of the father and son had changed in ways neither could have imagined. The company's office was now in Queens, in the same neighborhood where Joseph had lived for 20 years. Richard had sold the luxurious space on the Upper East Side and rented a renovated warehouse on Carolina Avenue. The glass walls were replaced with exposed brick. The Italian marble gave way to polished concrete. And where there once were expensive abstract paintings, now hung photographs of the local community. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," shouted Mrs. Davis, the owner of the corner bakery, waving from her window. "The coffee's hot!" Richard waved back, smiling. In the first few days after the move, he had found the intimacy with the neighbors deeply strange. In the wealthy neighborhood where he lived before, he didn't even know the doorman's name. In Queens, he couldn't walk 2 blocks without stopping to chat with someone. "Son, the mail came for you," Joseph said as Richard entered the office. He was sitting behind a simple wooden desk, wearing reading glasses and analyzing some papers. It was still hard to believe that his 60-year-old father was learning to use a computer and understand financial spreadsheets. What kind of mail? An invitation to a party. Looks important. Richard took the golden envelope and immediately recognized the letterhead. It was from Vivian Montgomery. His heart raced, not with anxiety but with curiosity. What could she want after 3 months of total silence? He opened the envelope and read the invitation aloud. "Richard, I hope this invitation finds you well. I would like to invite you to the opening of my new art gallery. It would be an honor to have you there. Sincerely, Vivian." Joseph took off his glasses and looked at his son. "Are you going?" "I don't know. What do you think?" Joseph leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Son, I've learned something these last few months. Sometimes people change, and sometimes they just pretend they've changed. The only way to find out is to give them a chance. But what if it's a trap? What if she wants revenge for what happened that night? Then you do what you've always done since you were a kid, when someone tried to hurt you." "What's that?" Joseph smiled. "You come home and tell your dad." Richard laughed, putting the invitation in a drawer. "I'll think about it." At that moment, the office door opened, and in walked Charlie, a 16-year-old boy who lived in the nearby community. 3 weeks earlier, Joseph had caught him trying to steal a part from Richard's car. Instead of calling the police, he had offered him a job. "Mr. Joseph, I finished organizing the stockroom," the boy said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Can I go? I have tutoring at 2. "Of course, son. But come here first." Joseph got up and went to a cabinet from which he took an envelope. "Your first paycheck," he said, handing the money to Charlie. "I counted it 3 times to make sure it's right." The boy's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time in his life he had received money for honest work. "Mr. Joseph, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. You just need to study and become a good man. That's payment enough. When Charlie left, Richard looked at his father with admiration. How do you do that? Do what? See the good in people, even when they do wrong. Joseph went back to his desk, putting his glasses on again. See, Daddy, to be sure. Son, when you spend 40 years fixing broken things, you learn that almost anything can be fixed, even people. That afternoon, Richard decided to accept Vivian's invitation, not out of morbid curiosity or a desire for confrontation, but because his father's words had touched something inside him. Maybe she really had changed. Maybe she deserved a second chance. The gallery was on the south side, in a historic building in Brooklyn Heights. When Richard arrived, wearing a simple suit and his grandfather's watch in his pocket, he found a completely different environment than he had expected. Instead of the abstract and expensive works he had imagined, the walls displayed photographs and paintings portraying ordinary people, workers, street children, the elderly, humble families. Richard. He turned and saw Vivian approaching. She looked different. Her hair was simpler, she wore almost no makeup, and was in a discreet dress, instead of the flamboyant models she used to flaunt. Vivian. What a surprise. Thank you for coming. Honestly, I didn't think you would. I almost didn't, he admitted. But my father told me that sometimes people change. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. Your father is a wise man. He always was. They walked in silence through the gallery. The works were impressive, powerful portraits that captured the dignity of simple people, the beauty in simplicity, the strength in vulnerability. Is this your work? Richard asked, stopping in front of a photograph of an old man repairing shoes on the street. No, it's by a photographer named John Charles. He lives in a community in the Bronx. Vivian stopped beside the image. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. About dignity, about important people. And I realized that I had never really looked at people like your father. Not really. To me, they were invisible. Richard watched her attentively. There was something genuine in her voice, a vulnerability he had never seen before. So I started walking around the city, paying attention, and I discovered that there's more beauty in a face marked by honest work than in all the plastic surgeries I've ever had. She led him to a smaller room where there was only one photograph on display. It was a portrait of a man with calloused hands, adjusting his tie in front of a mirror. Richard recognized him immediately. It was his father on the night of the party. How did you... Urtit. I asked a photographer who was at the party. When I saw the image, I understood that I had witnessed something rare, a moment of true nobility. Richard stood in silence, contemplating the photograph. His father looked handsome there, dignified, strong, real. Vivian, why are you showing me this? She took a deep breath before answering. Because I want to apologize, not just to you, but to your father. And I want you to know that that night changed my life. How so? I started a foundation for artists from underserved communities. John Charles was the first to benefit, but we already have 15 people in the program. She paused. And the name of the foundation is Hands That Build. Richard felt a chill. In honor of my father. In honor of all people like your father, who build, who create, who keep the world running while people like me, like I was, just enjoy the fruits of others' labor. They stood for a few minutes in silence, contemplating the photograph. Finally, Richard asked, would you like to see the new company? See what we're doing in Queens? Vivian looked at him surprised. You'd let me? My father always says that almost anything can be fixed, even people. When they left the gallery, the sun was setting over New York Harbor. The watch in Richard's pocket read exactly 6 o'clock, the same time that, every day for 40 years, his father left the shop to go home. And for the first time in months, Richard fully understood what that watch represented. Not just the time that passes, but the time that matters. The time dedicated to the right people, to the right values, to the choices that truly make a difference. The story was far from over. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Joseph woke up at 5 in the morning, as he always did. But this time, It wasn't the sound of the watch that woke him. It was the pain in his chest. It wasn't the first time. For the past few weeks, he had been feeling that tightness, that shortness of breath that haunted him, especially during the night. But stubborn as he had always been, he hadn't told Richard anything. He didn't want to worry his son, especially now when everything was going so well. He got up slowly, made coffee as he did every day, and looked out the kitchen window. Down on the street he could already see movement, the baker opening his shop, the newsstand vendor arranging the magazines, the simple life of Queens waking up to another day. "Good morning, Dad." Richard appeared in the kitchen, still in his pajamas. Since they moved the company to the neighborhood, he had rented an apartment on the same street as his father. "Sleep well?" "Like a log," Joseph lied, pouring coffee for both of them. "And you?" "I dreamed about that time you used to take me to the shop during school vacations. Remember? I was fascinated watching you work." Joseph smiled. "You were too curious. You asked about every screw, every tool. I'm still curious. Yesterday I learned how to change a tire watching you teach Charlie. Discovering how to change a tire at 35. Joseph laughed. Your mother would have died laughing. The mention of his late wife brought a silence heavy with longing. Mary had died 5 years earlier, from cancer, and in her final moments, she had made Joseph promise to take good care of their son. "Dad, there's something I want to talk to you about." Joseph looked up from his cup. "Go on, son." "Vivian's foundation wants to partner with us to develop a professional training program for young people from the community." "What kind of program?" "To teach mechanics, electronics, basic computer skills, to give kids like Charlie a chance." Joseph became thoughtful. "And you want my opinion?" "I want more than your opinion. I want you to be the program coordinator." The proposal took Joseph by surprise. "Richard, I'm already 60. I don't know if I have the energy for that." "Dad, you have more energy than men of 40. And you have something no university course teaches, life wisdom." Joseph felt his chest tighten again, but this time it wasn't physical pain. It was pure emotion. The idea of being able to teach other young people, of passing on the knowledge he had accumulated over decades, was too tempting to refuse. "All right, let's give it a try." 3 weeks later, the first group of 15 young people started classes in the warehouse that Richard had converted into a vocational school. Joseph, wearing blue overalls like in the old days, taught with a patience and dedication that impressed even the most skeptical. "Listen up," he would say to the students, holding a wrench. "This tool isn't just for tightening nuts. It's for building dreams. Every screw you tighten correctly is a step toward a better life." Charlie, now 17 and already considered the best student in the class, helped the younger ones with the patience he had learned from Joseph. "Mr. Joseph," said a 15-year-old boy named Matthew, "my mom wants to meet you. She said she's never seen me so excited to study." "Of course, son. Bring her by any time." It was a Thursday afternoon when the unthinkable happened. Joseph was explaining engines when he felt the chest pain return, this time stronger. He tried to hide it, but his legs gave way, and he leaned against the workbench. "Mr. Joseph," Charlie was the first to notice. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, son. Just a little tired." But Richard, who had just arrived, saw immediately that something was wrong. He knew his father too well to be fooled. "Dad, we're going to the doctor now." "No need, son. It's just fatigue. It's not a discussion." Charlie canceled the rest of the classes today. At the hospital, after a battery of tests, the diagnosis came like a thunderbolt. Joseph had suffered a minor heart attack. Nothing serious, according to the doctor, but a clear warning that he needed to slow down and take better care of his health. "How old are you, sir?" asked Dr. Carlos, the cardiologist. 60. "And how many hours a day do you work?" Joseph exchanged a look with Richard. "About 10, 12 hours. That has to change. A maximum of 6 hours a day, light exercise, a controlled diet, and plenty of rest." When they left the hospital, father and son walked in silence to the car. Finally, Richard asked, "How long have you been feeling this and not telling me?" Joseph sighed. "A few weeks." "Why?" Because I didn't want to worry you. You were so happy with the projects, with the school. Dad, Richard stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and held the shoulders of the most important man in his life. Nothing, you hear me, nothing is more important to me than your health. No project, no company, no dream is worth more than having you well. Joseph felt his eyes well up. Son, I'm scared. Scared of what? Of not being able to see you get married, have kids. Of not having enough time to teach everything I still want to teach. Richard hugged his father right there, in the middle of the street, not caring about the passing cars or the people watching. You've already taught me everything I needed to learn. Dad, the rest is just bonus time. That night, sitting on the balcony of Joseph's apartment, father and son talked late. The pocket watch lay on the table between them, reflecting the light from the street lamp. You know, son, when your mother died, I thought my life was over too. And now I know she lives on in you, in every right choice you make, in every person you help. Joseph picked up the watch. And this watch isn't just an object. It's a symbol of everything our family represents. Dignity, work, love, exactly. And that will never die, no matter what happens to me. Don't talk like that, Dad. Joseph smiled. I'm not talking about dying, son. I'm talking about living, about truly living, knowing that what we've built together will continue to exist long after we're both gone. Richard picked up the watch and put it in his own pocket. Then let's make a pact. What pact? You're going to take care of yourself. Follow the doctor's recommendations to the letter, and I'm going to ensure our story continues to be told through the young people you teach. Deal. They hugged again, and in that hug were 40 years of love, sacrifice, pride, and hope. The watch in Richard's pocket read 11:43 at night, but for them time had stopped, because some moments are eternal, regardless of what any clock says. A year after the scare at the hospital, Joseph was sitting in the front row of a ceremony he never imagined he would witness. In front of him, 15 young people from the first class of the vocational school were receiving their completion certificates. Charlie, now 18, was called as the class speaker. When I was a kid, he began, his firm voice echoing through the packed auditorium, I thought my destiny was sealed, that if you're born poor, you die poor. Until I met two men who taught me that you build your own destiny with your own hands. Joseph felt a lump in his throat. Beside him, Richard smiled proudly, recording everything on his phone to show Vivian later, who had become one of the project's main supporters. Mr. Joseph, Charlie continued, looking directly at the man who had changed his life, you taught me that honest work is nothing to be ashamed of, that dignity has no price, and that a man is measured by the strength of his character, not the size of his bank account. The applause was long and emotional. Joseph tried to stand up to thank him, but Charlie stopped him with a gesture. I'm not finished yet, the boy smiled. Mr. Richard, you taught me that true success is being able to look in the mirror and like the person you see, and that sometimes to rise in life, you first need to step down from your pedestal. More applause. Richard discreetly wiped his eyes. Therefore, Charlie concluded, on behalf of all the students, we want to announce that our first junior enterprise will be called Hearts Watch Mechanics and Electronics, in honor of the two men who taught us that the most important time is the time we dedicate to doing good. Joseph could no longer contain himself. Tears rolled freely down his face as Richard hugged him, too emotional to say anything. After the ceremony, there was a small party in the school's courtyard. The students' families, neighbors, project supporters, everyone celebrated not just the graduation, but the transformation of an entire community. Mr. Joseph, said Mrs. Davis from the bakery, holding a piece of cake, my grandson Peter wants to enroll in the next class. He says he wants to be a mechanic, just like you. It will be a pleasure to teach him, Mrs. Davis. And Mr. Richard, she continued, thank you for not abandoning the neighborhood when you got rich. So many entrepreneurs leave here and never look back. Richard smiled. Mrs. Davis, I learned that you don't abandon your home. You expand it. During the party, Joseph stepped away from the crowd and went to sit on a bench in the small garden they had created at the back of the school. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. May I join you? It was Vivian who had just arrived. Of course, my dear. In recent months, Joseph had gotten used to calling her that. Vivian had become almost like a daughter to him, visiting the house on Sundays, helping with projects, participating in the family life as she had never participated in any family. Mr. Joseph, can I confess something? You can. That night at the plaza when I laughed at you, it wasn't pure malice. It was fear. Joseph looked at her surprised. Fear of what? Fear of recognizing in you everything I was not. Dignity, simplicity, true love. It was easier to laugh than to admit that I was empty inside. Joseph placed his hand on her shoulder, as he would with children he never had. My dear, everyone feels empty inside sometimes. The difference is what we do to fill that emptiness. And how do I fill it? You're already filling it. Look around. How many lives have you helped change with your foundation? How many dreams have you helped realize? Vivian smiled, wiping away a tear that insisted on rolling down her cheek. I learned that from you two. From you and Richard. No, my dear, you learned that on your own. We just helped you remember who you really were under all those masks. At that moment, Richard approached them. Dad, it's time to go. The doctor said not to overdo it. Joseph had religiously followed all the medical recommendations. He worked only 4 hours a day, took morning walks, ate healthily, and for the first time in 40 years, truly took care of himself. I'm coming, son. I just want to watch the sunset. The three of them stood there in silence, contemplating the dying day. It was a comfortable silence, a family silence, of people who love each other without needing to prove anything. Dad, Richard said after a few minutes, there's something I never told you. What's that? That night at the party when I saw you being humiliated for the first time in my life, I understood what you felt when I was ashamed of you. Joseph turned to his son. Richard, no, let me speak. For years, I thought you didn't notice. But you did, didn't you? And still, you never called me out on it. Never made me feel guilty. Because I loved you more than I loved my wounded pride, and I love you more than I love any success I could ever have. Richard took the watch out of his pocket. That's why I want you to have this back. No, son. It's yours now. It's not mine. It never was. It always belonged to the family. And as long as you're here, you are the family. Joseph took the watch, feeling the familiar weight of the metal in his hands. He opened the cover and read again the inscription his own father had engraved decades before. Time passes. Love remains. You know what we'll do, Joseph said, closing the watch. We'll keep this together, and when the time comes, we'll pass it on to the next in the family. What next? Richard laughed. I don't even have a girlfriend. You will. And you'll have children. And they'll learn from this watch the same thing you learned. What's that? That the most valuable time isn't the one that marks the hours. It's the one that marks the heart. Vivian, who had listened to the whole conversation in silence, whispered, Can I be the godmother to these children who are yet to come? Joseph and Richard laughed at the same time. Of course you can, Richard replied. Actually, how about we start thinking about finding me a girlfriend? I've already thought of it, Joseph said with a mischievous grin. Mrs. Eleanor has a single granddaughter. Dad! The three of them laughed, and the sound of that laughter echoed through the garden, mixing with the last rays of sun and the murmur of the party that continued in the courtyard. That night, when they got home, Joseph put the watch in his nightstand drawer, next to Mary's photograph. Before closing the drawer, he whispered, We did it, my love. We raised a good man. 10 feet away, in the next room, Richard fell asleep peacefully for the first time in many years. He didn't dream of money, professional success, or social recognition. He dreamed of an auto repair shop where a man with calloused hands taught his son that a person's worth is not measured by what they have, but by what they do with what they have. And somewhere between dream and reality, the silent ticking of a pocket watch continued to mark time. Not the time that passes, but the time that remains. The time of love, of family, of values that transcend generations. The time of the heart. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.